All right, on to the next session here. This one is a threefer. We'll talk about some CephFS multi-tenancy features, and then some of the OpenStack stuff, specifically around Manila, I believe. So this was 3 blueprints in one. Sage had 2 and Danny had 1. There's a combined pad that we can take some notes on. But Sage, you want to kick off and give us a little background on what this is? And we're running about 15 minutes behind, so maybe we can make up some time too.
Okay, so a couple different subjects. I think probably it makes sense to start with just, this is sort of capturing all the OpenStack stuff. To start with the high level, what we want to look at here. So Danny, you listed a few topics to discuss.
Yeah. One topic was third-party testing. So yeah, that's we discussed it basically last Ceph Developer Summit already. So I want to come back to that because from my feeling, we still need third-party testing support in the OpenStack stuff. So there's currently, as far as I know, no testing against an real Ceph cluster. So yeah, I guess it's mandatory, in fact. So yeah, we would need a cluster for that, and as far as I understand, a Jenkins installation and a connection to the OpenStack system to test the code on each commit or on each review.
So we don't have an OpenStack instance in the Sepia lab yet, although we probably will sometime soon. But we also don't have a huge amount of like extra hardware. So I think the ideal situation would be that some of the people who are doing more of the OpenStack work, like maybe the Red Hat OpenStack group or Morantis or Canonical or these people who already have OpenStack testing environments, that they include Ceph testing as part of their tests, which I believe most of them presumably do.
In particular, I thought that upstream OpenStack was testing with Ceph in some capacity, and I see Josh just got on.
Yeah, so these days, actually upstream is testing with Ceph real Ceph clusters. Since the DevStack packages are finally merged in the last cycle, we got the tests stabilized on CephFS. Basically, every upstream job now is running so with Ceph as a non-voting job as part of the regular Jenkins run. And right now, that's I think just under Cinder and Nova. I can't remember if it's on Glance as well or not, but it's at least a lot of the Cinder and Nova jobs with using Ceph.
So is the idea to have it in the gate directly or as a third-party test?
It's in the gate directly right now already.
Okay.
It's just
non-voting for the gate currently. Okay.
Okay. You can see it as the DevStack DSVM full dash Ceph run.
So those are pulling stable releases though, presumably, right? Like any downstream
those using
OpenStack testing or whatever.
They're using whatever is current in like Fedora and Ubuntu.
Okay. Because what we somewhere we need to test like master or next or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a separate problem though.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think the general plan for the community lab infrastructure is that we're going to get an OpenStack instance at some point, and we're going to use that to do like all of the VM management for our tests. So we'll have at least an OpenStack that we can do some dogfooding with. The same way we're dogfooding CephFS right now. But even then, it won't be like on master. It's going to be on, the most recent stable release or release candidate or something like that. I'm not sure where exactly.
Yeah, I guess that's at least at the beginning. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So the other 2 items you had, Danny, were CephFS for Manila, which I think we should do.
Yeah,
last because I have a whole thing on that. And then how to keep compatible with Swift Object Store REST API interface. So I think there are a couple things there. One is that the biggest sort of compatibility gap that we have right now is with the way that we deal with namespaces and sort of tenant container or whatever. With the S3 API, you have a global bucket namespace essentially, and with Swift you have a per tenant, per user namespace. And so there's a blueprint that's on the schedule to discuss Yehuda's plan for addressing that. But I think it's tomorrow, or is it the end of today? It might be at the end of today. So that's the biggest gap. I think the other sort of key thing on the Swift side to backfill is that right now we have Swift tests as part of the regression suite, but it's an old version of Swift tests. And it really just needs somebody with some time on their hands to go get the latest version of Swift tests and run it and like figure out what fails and mark those things as, doesn't pass and open tickets for it, so that what does pass actually passes and we can add it to the regression suite, and then we can whittle away at the things that don't pass, or whatever, something along those lines. And there's been a recent flow of tickets from, I apologize, I'm forgetting the guy's name, at Marantis, I believe, fixing a bunch of Swift compatibility stuff. So there are some interested people who are addressing these issues. But probably the biggest thing that's going to sort of take a big bite out of that is getting a more recent version of the tests running.
Okay.
It's probably worth saying that some of the other big things which are still big things, they're probably all equivalent, but there are still some API calls missing, like object versioning and expiration. So we've got object versioning, but it's S3 only. So because the S3 and Swift stuff works differently. So I think versioning and expiration, like this, are the most noticeable gaps that we need to close after the multi-tenant namespace.
Yeah, I think it's probably worth mentioning that there isn't currently a plan to implement Swift object versioning because it's kind of lame in comparison to what the S3 versioning does. This doesn't really, it's not the same, and it's not super sophisticated. But I think the expiration is more interesting. But if there are people who are interested in that specifically, then obviously we should discuss and revisit that. But it wasn't something that sort of we were prioritizing, at least. I mean, Danny, can you say a little about what's the motivation here, or what's the requirement, or
to be
more better Swift? Yeah.
No, only to be able to really replace it. I mean, to run in Ceph with an Swift interface, so a compatible version. So.
Yeah. Okay. I think
because I have seen installations where somebody is installing Swift and Ceph, makes no sense from my point of view.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's always going to be some gaps because the feature set and the way that the Swift API is pretty sort of linked to the backend architecture. So it's always going to be a little bit different. But I think that those are sort of the corner cases that the vast majority of people don't really notice. So my sense is that once we knock out the namespacing thing, I think that's the thing that people actually notice. Then it'll be pretty good. But it'd be very interesting to see sort of what the user reports are.
I would like, at least something in the documentation what is really missing or where the gap is. So that would be nice.
Yeah,
it's the same for S3, I guess. I mean, we're also missing some features there, and I don't know what the future in this area is, because the S3 library we use currently in the code is also outdated and no longer really maintained. So not sure what there's no real maintenance there at the moment.
Yeah, if I remember,
there was a discussion.
I believe that's only used for GitHub. I think that library is only used for the benchmark tool.
Yeah. Okay.
I think.
Okay.
So it might be easier to drop it if we're concerned about maintenance than anything else. But especially when there are other tools like CauseBench and I don't know, whatever else that are probably sort of better maintained.
Okay.
Okay. This will probably come up later, but I think the main other sort of thing happening with Rados Gateway is that we're talking about shifting to the Civet Web front end, and so all the Apache configuration stuff should hopefully be simplified, assuming we don't sort of discover issues. So I think that'll, anyway, yeah, it ended up being a pretty nice solution. Okay, which brings us to Manila, which has another blueprint. So I started a thread on this a couple days ago. There are sort of several ways to approach this. It looks like people are sort of playing with a bunch of them. So I'm not a Manila expert, so I'm probably going to get some of this wrong. But as I understand it, there's sort of 4 different ways that you can approach it. So the high level goal obviously is to just make sort of file as a service in OpenStack just work, however, whatever it happens on the back end, but have it be sort of a usable, stable, viable service that's backed by Ceph in some way. So it's a single storage backend. So the simplest way to do this is using the default driver, which, as I understand it, is basically taking a Cinder volume and mapping it to the Manila VM that then exports NFS. And that obviously works because Cinder works, and you can use RBD for Cinder. But that's kind of a lame solution by most measures, but it works. Whatever. The Ganesha driver is recently went in, I think, for this last release, and the Red Hat's storage has worked a lot on this, mostly in the context of Gluster. That's was their motivation, but it actually doesn't matter. You just configure Ganesha either to re-export Gluster or re-export CephFS. And in that case, it's using the Ganesha driver, essentially just use links to the client library. So in the Gluster case, it links to libgf API, and in the Ceph case, it links to libCephFS. And so it'll take an existing shared file system and re-export it via NFS. That seems to be the sort of the preferred route that most people are looking at, because it gives you all the network isolation and multi-tenancy stuff that you mostly want, so that the only thing that's on the client network is the Ganesha VM, and so that's sort of the security cut point. And then that one VM can talk to the backend storage network to re-export whatever it is. And that is basically there, although I don't know who's actually been playing with it or testing it with Ceph. It would be great to hear people try it out. As I understand it, it's already in the OpenStack tree. I think the performance in general is going to be okay. You are still going through this extra gateway, so it's not going to be as fast as sort of a native file mount. But for a cloudy environment, it doesn't matter so much. The third alternative is to do a native driver. So this would be a new Manila driver that's specific to Ceph, that basically configures things so that the guest VM can directly map the Ceph file system. It turns out that the driver doesn't actually do anything within the guest, because there's no agent at Manila. All it's doing is setting up like the security keys and the exports. So in the Ceph case, it actually doesn't do very much. It would just create like a new authentication key, and create a directory that is sort of that authentication key would ostensibly be able to export. And then it's the guest's responsibility to then go actually mount Ceph based on that. That's my understanding, at least.
Yeah, that's not completely correct. We had a discussion on the Manila mid-cycle meetup, and the one problem is that Manila is requiring some features from the shared file system. There is stuff like snapshotting and so on. And from my point of view, that are optional features, but the project lead doesn't think so at the moment. So what we are working on is splitting up Manila to have these features optional, but if that's going in and in which way is open at the moment.
Yeah. I think the feature is specifically being able to create a snapshot, or to take the snapshot and turn it into a writable volume.
at least to create and restore, as far as I know. Maybe Mark, do you remember what the real feature is? I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I mean it goes to the actual share and it's creating and restoring a volume. That's the thing. I'm quite sure that every driver has their own interpretation what this is meaning, but yeah, in general they don't want to allow that a driver let's say exclude features out of the box. They want to have all the features in place for all the drivers.
Wasn't there discussion in one of the IRC meetings about how the only thing that was going to be able to implement that was NetApp filers?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's currently
currently
the project is really NFS and NetApp centric.
Yeah, that's one of the issues. But nevertheless, I think we can try to push that it's not going that path. I mean, it's just one idea of the PTL. Yeah. We can try to push them.
The other difficulty with this one though is the networking, and I don't remember, or I'm not sure if I ever understood where they came down on that, but because Manila does very little networking on its own, right? It sort of has a few hooks into Neutron, but for a native driver where you have to talk to an entire storage infrastructure, then you need to do a lot of hacking with the routing tables or whatever.
You're talking. I don't know anything about
a lot of things with the network stuff. And I'm not sure if like the Gluster native drivers are doing that, or if the admin just has to set it up for the VM externally, or what.
I asked the person who did the Gluster native driver when I was in Brno a couple weeks ago, and they basically said that yes, you just have to make the guest on the same network as the storage, and the driver, as I recall, the driver doesn't do anything. It just sort of assumes that this is the topology. So the assumption is that you would only use this in an environment where it's single tenant and you don't have these separate network.
And that's why we have this third option. So what we want to use is in our case, if CephFS enterprise ready is, to use VirtFS or P9 to map it to the VM, and that's makes it a little bit easier.
Yeah. So this one is a tricky one. I think the model makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's the analog to what we do with block currently. Because it sort of isolates the VM. I think the problem there is that is the sort of the maintainership of VirtFS 9P. Somebody told me that IBM is no longer maintaining it. I'm not sure if that's true or not. We should confirm that before sort of spreading that. But so that's one question. I'm also not sure that it's actually the 9P is a great protocol for this. Like it was sort of a convenient hack for them. It was the simplest existing network file protocol that they sort of saw that they thought would be the thinnest, but it's not necessarily ideal. And actually, when I talked to somebody at FAST about this, I was talking to Christoph about it, and I basically said that it seems like there should just be a first class like virtualization, like a VirtIO equivalent called VirtFS or something, but not using 9P, like just invent your own thing that actually maps the guest file system as cleanly as possible onto a host file system. And he shook his head and he's like, that's stupid. That's a waste of time. You should just use NFS and like use and make sure that the data path for NFS uses VirtIO sort of to optimize the data path essentially, but just reuse the existing protocol. So that's another option, but I don't know how much actual work is involved there. So I think I guess long story short, I'm not entirely sure assuming we want to take this overall architecture where you're using something like VirtFS or VirtFS, I'm not sure what the right technical solution is to accomplish that.
Would it be an option to write like the RBD driver, a driver for CephFS directly to QEMU libvirt or whatever?
Yes, I mean that's kind of that's the VirtFS thing that I was talking about. Yes, but that means that you have to write a kernel file system that you then get into the mainline kernel that is sort of equivalent to the VirtIO block driver that sort of understands that if I'm in a hypervisor, I'm just going to like put this stuff in this memory buffer and and it's going to magically do the right thing. So it would be a whole full-blown engineering project that would then need to make it into mainline and would be years before it's in any distros.
Okay.
Probably. Which is why I think NFS is attractive.
9p not packaged for RPM systems or something?
Well, it's a kernel level file system, and it's been there forever. But I don't think that.
Well, I mean, we just dropped it out of the Ceph QA suite stuff, didn't we, for Cinder?
Yes, right, and that's because it isn't in the
available.
RHEL kernel. That's what it is. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So the RHEL kernel doesn't support 9p.
So that would be a problem for.
Yeah, but I mean, that's basically what they were doing. Just to clarify, so QEMU had a 9p server sort of embedded in the hypervisor, and then it would use the existing kernel 9p client inside the VM, and QEMU would just sort of like capture that connection. Or I don't know exactly who the VM thought it was mounting, but that was the idea. But the idea was to reuse the existing client code, so they don't have to like make a whole new one. So I think the same thing could be done with NFS, but that today you could do it just by mounting, CephFS on the host and then exporting it to your guests, and then the guests would mount for using some like local network or whatever to the host, and then you could probably add some IO path optimization, although it probably wouldn't be too bad even as it is. But that's not a whole lot different than what you're doing with Ganesha. You're sort of making one of the network hops sort of zero latency, so it's better. But the semantics will be basically the same. So, I don't know. That's an option.
Yeah. So that's sort of the host-mounted NFS sharing, which I think they talked about doing instead of the Ganesha, or like instead of the existing Ganesha drivers.
Yeah.
I don't remember why they went differently. If there was any particular reason.
I'd be curious what the rationale was for taking the Ganesha route.
And I think it was going to be Ganesha anyway, but just you could either mount Ganesha in one place or you can mount it on every VM. And I think the answer was that's too many Ganesha instances running in the cluster.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not, because right now they're running it inside of their own special VMs. I'm not sure if they don't have the orchestration access to just like run a process on the host. Because I mean, if that's what you'd want to do if you were running it on running one per VM or one per host system. It's just like have one running in the host and then having it share out to whoever it should be sharing out to.
And maybe the goal is just to keep it simple. Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe a useful experiment to do would be to just actually set up, Ganesha running in a VM on a different host, doing the re-export thing, and then also mount CephFS on the host itself, and then compare the performance and behavior on the guest. Like, is it effectively the same? Is it faster? I don't think it would be slower, but because it means that this Manila driver has to be more complicated because it's orchestrating mounts on all the hosts. But I mean, if the performance is better and you don't have this extra VM running somewhere that's sort of a single point of failure, then that might be a good thing. I mean, effectively, the host becomes the single point of failure for the guest VMs, which it already is anyway. So it might actually simplify your.
But I mean, once you're using Ganesha, then can't you just use the NFS failure resistance protocols with round robin DNS and stuff?
Yeah, I guess so, probably. But then you just need to you still have to orchestrate these VMs. You have to make sure they're running, that if they stop, they get restarted. And I think there's some generic tooling in OpenStack to kind of do that, but I forget. Josh probably knows more. I seem to remember hearing something about that. Yeah. The other thing is that you could use the Linux kernel server on the host instead of Ganesha too. And then you don't even have that software dependency. Which might be better. It's probably faster.
Why?
Because then you're avoiding a trip into user space and back into the kernel.
Ganesha's not going into the kernel.
Well, for the network, where you go.
Okay.
whatever. Yeah, it's the same thing with any user space server. I don't know if Ganesha does any caching. It probably doesn't. Yeah, I don't know. It's probably not that much different, but probably for like doing high I/O rates, maybe it'll matter.
Mostly it's just convenient to have user space stuff that you can update independently of your kernel.
Yeah.
I'd want to go that route.
Yeah.
Especially for a cloud system where.
Yeah. So how am I here? He is.
Yeah, yes.
So you guys are using VertiFS? Am I remembering right?
Yeah, we just have a detailed look at it, and we just start to do it with 9P protocol. We found this has some performance problem with 9P protocol, and we wanted to optimize it at host side as well as kernel side. As we think 9P just like much like Swift or Sun protocol, not like file like NFS like. So it has some performance problem like maybe it doesn't handle with read hand and sequence write or sequence read like this. So we can do some optimization to handle these conditions, and maybe it can improve 9P particular performance. So I think we want to it much performance much like Fuse. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it would be great to sort of hear what you find on the list. I would, if you're experimenting, I'd be interested if you tried NFS too, and just to compare. So instead of using 9P to the host, use NFS to the host and see what happens.
Yeah. The 9P kernel module, and it has the Windows module in now, and we can use directly. So we use 9P.
I see.
So
okay.
it can reduce much of our works.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
The point is, if we want to use an 9P in Manila, then we have to integrate it in Nova. That's the only step that's needed.
Yeah.
It can't go into Manila itself.
And getting things in Nova takes a long time. So we should create a spec for that, and for sure
start as soon as possible.
We should start as soon as possible, and it won't be in for this release for sure. So yeah, the target would be the next release.
Yeah,
and that's because it's a. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
So
it has to go in Nova because it's a command line argument to QEMU, because you're.
Yeah, because the libvirt config needs to be changed, and that's the job of Nova.
So the idea would be that so currently for Cinder they have a command like volume attach in Nova, and the idea would be to have a file system attach in Nova. So I mean in that Manila is not really involved. It's just Nova will change the XML file to make the file system path through, and that's it. It's not.
Okay.
I don't expect that it's many lines of code, but getting things in Nova takes a long time.
Yeah. So this would be one reason why it might be worth checking out the NFS option, because you wouldn't need any of that, right? You just have to configure the NFS server that happens to be on the host. Yeah. Is there already like a local subnet or something that you'd be able to use that's like set up by default or something so that the guest can talk to the host? Or would you need to hope Nova to like set?
I didn't get the question. What was the question?
Is there a network that is already configured that lets the guest talk to services that are on the host? Or would that be something that we would need to...
not usually, no. So for Manila, usually you have your NFS endpoint in a different network, and you just set up a router in between. You're not usually have them in the same network. I think it's an option for Manila to have that, but I think in the default case you have a router in between the two networks.
Okay. But in the case where you're running this sort of fifth hypothetical case where you're running the NFS server on the host itself, then you would probably want to have like just a small subnet that
that would be
so there's no, because you want it to sort of minimize the.
But there isn't any driver that does that.
Does that?
Yeah. In that case, you want to have something bridged, but I think this is something that it has some security implications.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, maybe like you
have a host communication between host and the guest, and could be.
Yeah. I mean, you would
communication to
you'd want to make it a network that like nothing is bound to, unless you have like a specific service that says I want to like provide a service on this local. Yeah, whatever. Okay. Well, I think if somebody is interested and wants to try this out, it would be good to have sort of some idea whether this is something that is interesting or not going into the next OpenStack Summit. So we know whether the 9P path or the NFS path or the existing Manila path with their Ganesha path or whatever is the one that we want to get behind.
Yeah.
Does anybody sort of want to sign up for that? Who's experimenting with this?
Yeah, I plan to work on it. So yeah.
Okay.
I can take it.
That'd be awesome. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks a lot. Okay. And we should also hear more from Halmai as his work progresses too, and see how that goes.
Are we coming close to the end of this one, or are we still got more to do?
We've got the sort of the last topic, which is that's multi-tenancy. So if we're doing 9P or NFS or anything like that, then it doesn't really matter because that gateway is sort of handling the boxing the client into a particular directory generally. But if in the case of the native CephFS driver where the guests actually get to mount the file system directly, then suddenly Ceph is the one who's on the hook for security. So I opened another blueprint that just called out sort of what the current gaps are with multi-tenancy. That in that Manila case are important, and sort of also any other CephFS case where you want to have it's a multi-tenant environment. So I can just summarize them really quickly. We don't have to go into a whole lot of detail, but if people are interested in this would be a great place to sort of get involved. So the first simplest thing is just to allow a read-only mount. Currently the capabilities when you are specify what you can do with the file system is whether you can mount and do anything you want or whether you can't mount. So having read-only is sort of the easiest iteration on that. The other thing that would be helpful is having just a root squash. At least one user came back and said that as long as there was this is sort of sufficient for their mostly single tenant environment. And it would basically emulate what NFS does, where you can't do things that only root could do. You can only do things that a user could do as that user. I don't think it wouldn't be too difficult. I think it's the semantics are a little bit difficult to describe, and they're not really written anywhere. But I think they're not too challenging to puzzle out. But the more complicated one is, and probably the one that's most important, is to be able to make a path-based mount restriction, where you say this, this capability only lets you mount, home user, and not, /root or something like that. So right now the syntax is there, and we sort of parse the capability, but we don't enforce it at all. And I think this is mostly the optimistic view is that this is mostly a series of checks in the server.cc, sort of the initial request path when we're sort of getting the handle, and just verify that path is sort of within the the locked-in zone. Somebody on the phone, or can we like?
Oh, I thought that was the music to end.
No, that is hold music from somebody on the phone.
Yeah. Patrick, you know how to make that go away?
I'm working on it. I don't know.
All right. You can just enjoy my summary with some background music. There we go. Yeah, so the path-based mount one is probably the most complicated, but also probably the most valuable. And then the last thing is just sort of securing the data path as well. So you can specify layouts in CephFS that say that all new files are created in a particular Rados pool, so the data goes somewhere else. And you can make capabilities for the clients that sort of only let them read and write to those pools. That is enough, and that you can lock different tenants into different Rados pools, assuming you also have the path-based thing. But the problem is that you don't actually generally want to have tons of Rados pools. They're sort of meant to map to the different types of number of different policies, placement policies you have, and not necessarily the number of tenants, which could be 2 or 1,000 or 100,000. So we have a new namespace capability in Rados, but CephFS doesn't use it. So the idea here is just to extend the current Ceph file layout structure to use an additional field for the just numbered namespaces. So you could specify within this pool and also within a namespace in that pool. Which I think it'd actually be pretty simple. There's just a bunch of different places that you have to touch where the MDS and the client are doing I/O, and make sure you fill in that namespace in the Rados context when you're doing the actual I/Os. So that's mostly, I guess that's mostly it. Are there any questions about that, or any comments about how important this is or is not?
So the reason you're interested in just using integers for namespaces is because it's a straight memory mapped struct, right? Without any of our encoding stuff.
Yeah, it's like a fixed size struct, and if we have to change the encoding, then it gets complicated, and we have unused fields, and so it'd just be easy to just reuse one of those fields as a number.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and presumably, if you're doing this, CephFS is the only user of that Rados pool, so there's no.
Yeah.
Just because Rados lets you name them namespaces with a string doesn't mean that CephFS needs to use that full.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I guess my main concern is that then sharing is harder because clients can't share data with each other.
If they are writing into a namespace, then the only people that they would be sharing with would be other clients who also have access to that same namespace.
Yeah. So, right? But it means you can't.
So they shouldn't
publicize within a data center, like here's a file I wrote and I want to share it with people. And if you want to provide data center wide access to something, then it needs to be a namespace that everyone has read and write access to.
But I mean, it would be identical to the fact that they're allowed to mount that path. So it'd be sort of your responsibility to make sure that your permission to access home user is sort of similar to your Rados capability to access that directory.
Yeah.
It's a little bit annoying to sort of orchestrate that on from an administrator perspective, but
yeah. I mean, I think this is better than anything else we can do short term, but I just want people to note those sorts of limitations, that once you have security, then it's sort of iron doors that you can't open.
We might need to think about adding some tooling to allow people to move things between pools when that situation comes up.
Or between namespaces or something, yeah.
But, right, between namespaces or between pools.
There's just no good way to do that.
Well, I mean,
it's an order and operation.
Yeah, I mean, there's no trick, but I'd rather tell people they can do it slowly than that they can't do it at all.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, but
I guess
in particular means that you need to have organized namespaces that are shareable.
So the
way to lock access to them. Once they're shareable, then everyone can write to them.
The alternative path that's more complicated but doesn't have this restriction is to use the MDS as a sort of intermediate key capability grantor. That's so if the MDS says you're allowed to read and write that directory, then it gives you a special token that lets you do that. The problem is that it's much more complicated, and we have to figure out how to generate those capabilities efficiently and make them
It's an
work.
open research area, which is awesome, but
yes,
that's kind of the nuclear authentication option.
Yeah. So traditionally, in the past, we've sort of shied away from this because it all sort of indications seem to be that it was sort of infeasible as far as complexity and also just computationally generating all these keys. But there was a paper we read recently that seemed to indicate that it might not be so bad. That it used I think a symmetric key, and it was, but it's very complicated. So
Horus wasn't as bad.
So the
as you
namespace is sort of a
great.
What's that?
Oh, I remember several years ago you were like, oh, it's impossible, and Horus was not impossible, but it was not great either. There was definitely an overhead hit.
Horus is the one that had a funny name for the capabilities. They're like, was it Horus? No, this was a recent paper we read. It was like less than a year ago.
Okay.
No, it wasn't Mod. It didn't have anything to do with Ceph.
Really?
It was talking about it was like a new. It was a
the macaroons. Was it that one?
That's what it is. Yeah, that's what I want. That one. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that was the one.
Yes, those are better.
So it's kind of orthogonal to these particular things, but there's kind of a fourth additional thing that we've kind of gone hot and cold on, of having multiple file systems that you would actually be able to separate onto different MDSs. So, I mean, I think it's true that path-based command restriction is almost certainly the most useful thing immediately for people. But at the point where people actually started putting a cloud on top of this, I can easily see them wanting to have some separation for different types of users between different MDSs and stuff.
And that's actually possible even without multiple file systems, because you can pin subtrees to certain servers.
Do we currently have that pinning?
I think so. We certainly have exports. I think we can pin.
I thought you could export, but it didn't pin it there. It'll get like
it there. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, that
like
would be an easier step than multiple file systems, although maybe not a better one.
Yep. Yeah. It's sort of a middle ground as far as giving you the fault isolation.
Yeah.
But it would all still be in the same metadata pool at that point. I mean, if people really truly wanted isolation, then they need
separate MDSs. Yeah. So another great feature to add to the list that would be doing the multi-metadata server stuff. Multiple file system, multi-metadata server cluster stuff. Yeah. Okay. I think we're good. I think we're good on this one.
For that one?
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, sorry. Actually, one last thing. I guess the thing that that I'm lacking in sort of just thinking about these options is what proportion of users are interested in stuff that sort of only works in single tenant or trusted tenant environments versus those that that's out of the question. It's all multi-tenant, public cloudy stuff, and you need the strong security. I don't have a sense of how many people are deploying in each of those types. Does anybody have any perspective or thought there? I think your cloud is it's a public cloud, so the security is critical. And Danny, I assume for you too. But
actually, perhaps more interesting is who would want to use CephFS natively, or in which just using it with like a kernel or CephFuse driver is feasible, who needs it to be multi-tenant aware.
We are not sure. I mean, we can't use it before it's enterprise ready at all. So, but multi-tenancy is one feature we would need to run CephFS. I mean, what we would like to prevent is another level of indirection. I mean, NFS on CephFS sounds somehow strange, and from the performance perspective, it sounds even stranger. So I would like to, if I make the decision to use only one storage technology and kick out, for example, a NetApp server or something like that, then I want to use this storage technology directly and not again over NFS. So yeah, I would prefer, if we ever would be able to use CephFS, to use it directly. And then yeah, multi-tenancy is really needed. There's no way to use it in our environments without multi-tenancy.
I'll be right back.
Are we wrapped up on this one then? If Sage is wandering away?
I guess so. I was just going to say, I mean, the thing about native CephFS drivers, that means that anyone who's using Windows is going to need something else anyway, which isn't a big deal for most people, but for any cloud that's providing that and wants to have shared file data access, you're going to need NFS or something.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's maybe true, but in our environments we don't have any Windows. I think.
Okay.
All right.
It's a telco environment, and nobody knows what is running in all these appliances that comes from NFV Windows. But I hope there will be no Windows in this case. I mean, then we can for Windows VMs we can share it over NFS then. So Windows is that poor, so it doesn't make any difference if you share it over NFS in this case.
Sage, are you good with this one?
Yep.
All right, cool. Well, then we'll move into the next one.